A plane vanishes over the Pacific. A routine flight that never reaches its destination. When the survivors awaken on a remote island, the wreckage still smoldering behind them, they think the worst is over, but they're wrong. There are no rescue signals, no passing ships, no way home. And something is watching. Strange symbols carved into the trees, shadows moving just beyond the firelight, people disappearing in the night without a sound. At first, they believe the island is the danger, but the truth is far worse. Because this place has seen survivors before. The cycle has played out many times, and the real question isn't how they got here. It's why. As the whispers rise from the jungle, and a radio crackles to life, with a familiar voice repeating, "Welcome aboard Flight 217. Estimated arrival. Unknown." They begin to understand some flights never land. Some survivors were never meant to leave, and the island is waiting. Evelyn Hayes adjusted her seatbelt as the final boarding call echoed through the airport terminal, her fingers tightening around the strap of her carry-on. As an investigative journalist, she had spent years chasing stories in the world's most dangerous corners. Yet something about this flight felt wrong. She couldn't explain it, just a nagging unease creeping into her bones as she stepped onto the plane, her eyes instinctively scanning the faces of the other passengers. Businessmen with laptops, families with children, a few backpackers, flight attendants smiling too wide. It all looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. Sliding into her window seat in row 23A, she exhaled and pulled out her notebook, skimming through her last assignment before closing her eyes. A flight from Los Angeles to Sydney, 15 hours, of nothing but ocean below. The pilot's voice crackled through the speakers, a reassuring tone announcing clear skies ahead. But Evelyn barely listened as the engines roared and the plane lifted off, her stomach dropping slightly at the ascent. She stared out the window, watching the city lights fade into darkness. But before she could get comfortable, a strange movement caught her eye. A manlian, sharp-faced, wearing a dark hoodie standing near the emergency exit, glancing around too much, his hands twitching slightly. He wasn't adjusting his luggage. He wasn't looking for a seat. He was watching. Evelyn's instincts kicked in, years of experience telling her to take mental notes, to remember faces, to be aware. She didn't know what it meant yet, but something was about to happen. Hours passed, the cabin lights dimmed, passengers dozed off, wrapped in blankets, lulled by the quiet hum of the engines. Evelyn tried to sleep, but the unease wouldn't leave her, and then it happened. A sudden jolt, the kind that sent drink carts rattling and passengers gripping their armrests. The cabin lights flickered once, then twice, then went out completely. Darkness. A sharp gasp from somewhere in the back. The oxygen masks didn't drop. The intercom remained silent. Then a voice, low and commanding, slicing through the dark like a blade. Nobody move. Evelyn's breath caught. She turned her head slowly, barely able to make out the shape of the man from earlier now standing in the aisle. A gun raised, a black mask pulled over his face. A flight attendant let out a strangled sound, but he silenced her with a quick, sharp gesture. "This plane is under my control. Do as I say, and you live." The air in the cabin turned electric, fear crackling through the rows like wildfire. Passengers froze, some clutching their seats, some praying under their breath. Evelyn, heart pounding, kept her movements slow as she reached for her phonino signal. They were too far over the ocean. No way to call for help. The masked man stepped forward, his voice eerily calm. "We're making a detour. Buckle up. This is going to be rough." The plane lurched hard. Passengers screamed as the nose tilted downward, the sensation of freefall sending trays, bags, and bodies tumbling. Evelyn clutched the armrest, every muscle in her body tensed. The deafening roar of the engines mixed with the sounds of chaos, panic, and the undeniable realization that they were going down. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the flashing red warning light near the cockpit, the final, haunting confirmation that this was no accident. The first thing Evelyn felt was water, cold and relentless, lapping at her legs as she drifted somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. The sharp scent of burning fuel mixed with the salty air, and when she forced her eyes open, the world around her was a blur of smoke, wreckage, and distant screams. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her body ached. Her mind was disoriented, trapped between the horror of what had just happened and the nightmare unfolding before her. Then, instinct kicked in. Survive. Gasping, she pushed herself up from the wet sand, her fingers digging into the gritty shore as she tried to steady her breath. The plane was gone. At least, most of it. What remained was a twisted metal carcass, broken apart, half of it sinking beneath the rolling waves. Fires flickered along the debris-strewn beach, casting eerie shadows in the growing twilight. Bodies lay scattered, some moving, some too still. Somewhere nearby, someone was crying. Someone else was calling for help. Evelyn tried to stand but stumbled, pain flaring up her left side where something seatbelt, impact, debris had left a deep bruise. She clutched her ribs and turned her head, scanning the wreckage, searching for survivors. Who made it? Who didn't? And more importantly, who was responsible for this? Memories slammed back into her. The hijacker, the masked man. His voice cold and commanding. We're making a detour. Had he survived? Was he among them, blending in, hiding his face now that they were on the ground? Evelyn's eyes darted from one figure to another, searching for anyone familiar. A few feet away, a young woman in a flight attendant uniform was kneeling beside a motionless man, pressing desperately against his chest, trying to restart a heart that would never beat again. Nearby, an older businessman clutched his bleeding leg, face pale with shock. A little girl sat in the sand, staring vacantly at the ocean, as if waiting for someone to come back for her. Evelyn swallowed the rising panic. Think. Move. Survive. She forced herself to count in maybe 12 survivors visible. But how many more had been on the plane? 50? 60? And why hadn't anyone seen this island from the air before the crash? The jungle loomed just beyond the shore, dark, dense, and unwelcoming. Towering palms swayed in the warm breeze, but the further inland the trees stretched, the more unnatural they looked. Vines wrapped too tightly around trunks, roots twisted like grasping hands. Something about it felt off, as if it was waiting for them to step inside, watching, listening. A chill crawled down Evelyn's spine, but she pushed the feeling aside. There were bigger problems right now. A voice cut through the chaos, deep, authoritative, a man's voice. We need to get organized. Evelyn turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man, early 40s, military stance, a gash running down the side of his temple. His shirt was torn, but his posture was solid, steady. Ex-military, she guessed. Maybe a pilot, maybe a bodyguard, but definitely someone used to being in control. If you can move, start gathering supplies from the wreckage, he ordered. Food, water, anything that survived the impact. We don't know how long we're here. The survivors murmured in agreement, a few already moving toward the broken remains of the fuselage. But Evelyn wasn't listening. Her mind was on one thing: the hijacker. If he was here, he was blending in, hiding among them. And if he had planned this, if this wasn't just some random hijacking gone wrong, then the real danger wasn't just the island. It was him. And he was still out there. Evelyn's mind raced as she scanned the scattered survivors, her journalist instincts kicking in. She needed to assess the situation fast: who was injured, who was panicking, and more importantly, who was dangerous. The hijacker was out there, watching, pretending to be just another victim. But she had seen him before the crash. She just needed to figure out which face in the crowd belonged to the man who had put them here. The ex-military man, the one taking charge, barked another order. We need a head count. Everyone, listen up. If you're alive, speak your name. One by one, people called out, some shaky, some barely above a whisper. 12. Only 12 survivors. Among them, the military man, Reed Lawson. He introduced himself. His movements were calculated, and his eyes were sharp. Not a man easily fooled. A young flight attendant, still in shock, her hands trembling, her uniform torn. Mia Castillo, she said quietly. An injured businessman, his leg wrapped in a makeshift bandage, pain in his eyes. "Stephen Marsh," he grunted. A mother and daughter, the little girl still too silent, her mother holding her tight. A scruffy-looking backpacker, his clothes soaked in seawater, rubbing his temples like he was fighting off a concussion. A middle-aged woman with glasses, arms folded, her expression unreadable. A wiry man in his 30s, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. And a few others, but one of them was lying. One of them had hijacked the plane. Evelyn kept her breathing steady, her heart pounding as she memorized each face. Could the hijacker have changed his appearance? Cut his hair? Was he injured? Or was he already planning his next move? A sudden scream tore through the tense silence. Everyone turned. The flight attendant, Mia, was standing near the jungle's edge, her body frozen in fear. Evelyn rushed forward, the other survivors close behind. At first, she saw nothing but trees, but then her breath caught. Blood. Not just a few drops. A streak of red dragged through the sand, disappearing into the jungle. Someone was missing. Stephen Marsh, the businessman, muttered under his breath, "There were more of us, right? There were more after the crash." No one spoke, because they all realized it at the same time. They hadn't just lost people in the wreck. Someone or something had taken them, and the jungle had swallowed them whole. The silence after the discovery was deafening, a thick, suffocating weight pressing down on every survivor as they stared at the blood-streaked sand leading into the jungle. No one wanted to move, to acknowledge what this meant, that someone, or something, had taken one of them. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears as she instinctively turned her head, scanning the expressions of the survivors, watching for reactions. Fear, confusion. Panis, everyone wore some version of the same emotion, but she was looking for something different. Guilt. The hijacker was still here, still hiding, and she refused to believe this was a coincidence. But before she could analyze further, Reed Lawson stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We need to find out what happened," he said, his eyes narrowing at the dark tree line ahead. "Who was standing here last? Who saw anything?" Mia, the flight attendant, shook her head violently, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I just walked over here, and then I saw it. The blood. I don't even know who's missing." She sounded truthful, but Evelyn knew better than to take anyone at face value. The businessman, Stephen Marsh, ran a hand over his face, his breathing shallow. "Jesus Christ. They could still be alive, right? I mean, maybe they crawled off for help. Maybe..." His voice trailed off, the lie crumbling before it could fully form. No one walked away from injuries like that, not into an unknown jungle with no clear path. Reed exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, the wheels turning in his head. "We can't sit here doing nothing. We go in, see if we can find whoever's missing, and come right back, no splitting up." His words were met with quiet hesitation, but no one argued. No one wanted to admit it, but they all felt it. This island wasn't right. Evelyn turned her gaze to the jungle, the way the thick vines wrapped around trees like they were strangling them, the unnatural stillness beyond the first few feet. It was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an unspoken warning humming through the air. But still, she had no choice. She adjusted her stance and nodded. "I'm going," she said firmly, meeting Reed's gaze. "Someone has to document what's happening." A few others agreed, their voices shaky, but the rest stayed behind, their fear anchoring them to the safety of the wreckage. With Reed in the lead, Evelyn, Mia, Stephen, and the wiry-eyed man, who had finally given his name as Grayson, stepped into the jungle. The moment they crossed into the thick underbrush, it felt like entering another world. The dense canopy swallowing the last slivers of daylight, wrapping them in a damp, musky heat. The path was barely a path at all, just a thin break in the vegetation, as if something had been dragged through. Evelyn's breath hitched as she stepped carefully over the streak of blood, the dark crimson sinking into the dirt like it belonged there. The deeper they walked, the more the jungle seemed to close in around them, vines hanging like nooses, thick roots curling around their feet like hands trying to hold them back. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the path simply stopped. There, in the middle of a small clearing, was a pile of personal belongings. Clothes, shoes, a torn-up carry-on bag, a watch still ticking, but no sign of a body. Evelyn crouched, her fingers brushing over a shredded flight pillow soaked in blood, her stomach twisting into knots. It wasn't just the blood that was disturbing, it was the way everything had been placed. Deliberate, organized, like a warning. "No animal did this," she whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the pounding of her heart. Reed stepped beside her, his hand tightening around the crude knife he had fashioned from wreckage metal. "No," he agreed darkly. This was done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And then the sound came. A rustling, low at first, but unmistakable. Something or someone was watching them. Grayson let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to go. Now." But before anyone could move, a figure darted through the trees. Fast, almost inhumanly fast. The brush snapped behind them, footsteps moving too quickly. Circling them, trapping them. Evelyn's body tensed, every instinct screaming run. But then she saw it. In the tangled mess of vines ahead, a carved symbol deep in the bark. Old, unnatural. And below it, in the dirt, something even worse. A fresh set of footprints. Not one. Many. And they weren't alone. Evelyn's pulse hammered in her ears as she locked onto the footprints in the dirt. Some small, some impossibly large, all leading in different directions. They overlapped, scattered, as if whoever or whatever made them had been moving fast, circling, watching. Reed raised a hand, signaling for silence, his breathing measured but tense, his grip tightening on his makeshift knife. The jungle around them felt like it was closing in, the heavy humidity clinging to Evelyn's skin as she took a slow, deliberate step backward. The others barely breathed. Then, a rustling from the left. Another from behind. Footsteps. Fast. Deliberate. Then silence. Grayson's panicked whisper barely cut through the thick, oppressive air. "There's more than one." Evelyn glanced toward him, noting the sweat beading at his temple, his hands twitching like a cornered animal. "Shut up," Reed muttered, his voice dangerously low, his eyes scanning the jungle. And then the whispering started. Faint, too faint to be natural, weaving through the trees like the wind itself was speaking, carrying words they couldn't quite make out. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. They weren't alone. And whoever was out there wasn't running. They were waiting. Stephen was the first to snap, turning sharply on his heel. "Screw this," he muttered, his voice a little too loud, a little too close to breaking. "We have to." But before he could finish, something shot past them, just beyond the edge of their vision, a blur of skin and shadow, moving impossibly fast through the dense jungle. Mia let out a startled yelp, clapping a hand over her mouth too late. The whispering stopped instantly, and then came the laughter. A single voice, low, breathy, mocking. It sent ice through Evelyn's veins. She didn't know why, but something about it was familiar, like an echo of something she had heard before. The sound came from just ahead, from the symbol carved into the tree. It hadn't been there by chance. It was a message, a marker. Reed took a slow step forward, his shoulders squared. "Who's there?" No answer, but the feeling, the presence, it was there. They all felt it. A quiet, predatory energy. Whoever was watching them wasn't afraid. They were playing. Evelyn's hands clenched into fists as she stared at the carved symbol, her brain working fast. It looked ancient, but the lines were too sharp, too recent. Someone had made it deliberately. She turned to Reed, voice steady but low. "This isn't just a random island. Someone's been here before us." Grayson let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Great, fantastic, maybe they can show us the way off." But no one laughed with him because they all felt the truth sinking in. Whoever had made those marks, whoever had left those footprints, they weren't guides. They were hunters. And they had just found their next prey. Reed exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. "We move. Now." back to camp, slowly. No one argued. Step by step, they retraced their path, moving carefully through the dense foliage. But the air had changed. Before, the jungle had felt empty. Now it felt full. Full of something unseen, something just beyond the trees, something just out of reach. Evelyn felt it like static on her skin, an almost electric charge humming through the air, a certainty that eyes were locked onto her back. She stole a glance over her shoulder, nothing. But that meant nothing. The whispers hadn't returned, but the island was speaking to them in other ways. Through the shifting trees, the subtle crunch of leaves under unseen footsteps, the ever-present feeling of being watched. And then the smell. It hit them like a wall. Rot. Decay. Death. Mia gagged, covering her mouth. Grayson stumbled back a step, his face twisting in disgust. Evelyn fought the urge to choke, her stomach tightening against the overwhelming stench of something foul, something long dead. Reed was the first to break from the group, stepping toward the source of the smell, the others hesitating before following. And then they saw it. Hanging from the branches of a twisted tree, strung up like a grotesque warning sign body. But it wasn't a passenger. It was someone else. Someone who had been here long before them. The skin was leathery and stretched tight, the remains of clothing faded and torn. A makeshift satchel was still slung across the figure's chest, as if they had died running, caught too late. And carved into their forehead, deep, deliberate, the same symbol that was on the tree. Stephen swore under his breath, his hands shaking as he took a slow step back. "This island isn't empty," he whispered, horror sinking into his voice. "People have been here before." Reed was staring at the corpse, his jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists. "Someone did this," he murmured, voice unreadable, "and they're still here." Evelyn's eyes darted toward the satchel, her gut twisting. If this person had been here before them, then maybe, just maybe, they had answers. Ignoring the churning in her stomach, she stepped forward and reached for the bag. The others watched, silent, as she unbuckled the worn leather strap, reaching inside, fingers closing around old, tattered paper. She pulled it out, unfolding it with careful hands. And then, every drop of blood in her body turned to ice. Because it wasn't just paper, it was a flight log. Flight 217. Her flight. But the date at the top? It wasn't from today. It was from 20 years ago. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she gripped the weathered flight log, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she stared at the impossible date 20 years ago. It had to be a mistake. It had to be. Yet, as she flipped through the fragile, water-damaged pages, she saw something even worse. Passenger names. Names that meant nothing to her at first, but then her stomach dropped. One of the names had been crossed out. Not scratched over in panic, not scribbled out by accident, but deliberately, with deep, heavy strokes, as if someone wanted to erase the person completely. She traced the ink with her thumb, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who was this person? And why had someone made sure no one would ever remember them? Mia swallowed hard, stepping closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not possible, is it?" But no one answered, because no one had an answer. The jungle pulsed around them, humid air pressing against their skin, thick with the knowledge that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. Evelyn forced herself to look back up at the hanging corpse, at the symbol carved into its forehead. The realization hit her like a slap. Whoever this person was, they had been left as a message. Reed exhaled sharply, rubbing his jaw, his military-trained eyes scanning the surrounding trees. He wasn't just looking for a threath, was calculating, planning. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. "This means one of two things," he said evenly. "Either someone else crashed here before us, and they never got out, or this isn't the first time Flight 217 has gone down." The words sent a cold chill through Evelyn's spine. Had the plane been meant to crash? Had someone orchestrated this? It wasn't just a thought anymore. It was a pattern. Stephen let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're saying we're part of some repeating nightmare? Like we were meant to be here?" His tone was sarcastic, but his eyes were wide, desperate, as if he was hoping someone would tell him it wasn't true. No one did. Evelyn looked back at the flight log. If this was their flight, if it had happened before, then there had to be more. More logs, more proof, more bodies, and she needed to find them. But before she could speak, the jungle moved. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the trees, a flicker of motion in the deep green. Then a sound, crunching leaves, soft, steady footsteps, not panicked, not running, measured, deliberate, like someone was watching, like someone was approaching. Evelyn's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. Reed took a step forward, raising his knife slightly, his stance shifting into something ready, prepared. "Show yourself," he called out, his voice hard as steel. But there was no answer. Just silence. Then a voice, low, familiar, spoken just above a whisper. "I told you. You should have stayed at the wreckage." Evelyn's stomach twisted violently. She knew that voice. So did everyone else. Because standing at the edge of the clearing, stepping forward like he had been waiting for them all along, was one of their own. Grayson. The same man who had shivered with fear, whispered about leaving, panicked in the jungle. Except now, his posture was different. Relaxed. Too relaxed. His arms hung loosely at his sides, his lips curled slightly into something between amusement and warning. And then Evelyn saw it, the slight curve of something sharp and metallic, glinting in his hand. A knife. And blood on his sleeve. Her breath hitched. The missing survivor. The blood in the sand. The rustling in the trees. It had never been something else. It had been him. Grayson had been with them the whole time. He had acted afraid, played the part of the terrified survivor, but he wasn't one of them. He had been waiting for them to follow the trail. And they had walked right into his trap. Evelyn's breath came in sharp, controlled exhales, her mind racing as she took in every detail Grayson's stance. The blood on his sleeve, the faint twitch in his fingers. He wasn't scared anymore. He wasn't confused or desperate like the rest of them. He was in control. And where she had always been, the realization hit her like a blow to the chest. The hijacker. He had been with them from the start, blending in, watching, waiting. The others were frozen in place, the truth sinking in like quicksand. Mia's eyes darted to Reed, who had already taken a step forward, his muscles coiled, his grip tightening on his knife. Stephen barely moved, his breath coming out in quick, shallow bursts, panic setting in. Grayson, however, only smirked, taking a slow, deliberate step toward them, his boots pressing into the damp jungle floor. "I really thought you'd all be smarter than this," he mused, his voice smoother now, confident. "But I guess every group does the same thing, wanders too far, finds what they shouldn't, asks the wrong questions." His eyes flickered toward Evelyn. "And you ask too many?" Evelyn swallowed the cold fear gripping her throat and forced herself to speak. "This isn't the first time, is it?" She lifted the flight log slightly, letting the others see it again. "Flight 217 has crashed before. That means this was never about taking over a plane. It was about bringing us here." Her voice was steadier than she felt, but Grayson only smiled wider, amused. "You're catching on," he said, tilting his head. "Good. Most people don't get this far before." He made a small slicing gesture with his knife, letting the rest of the sentence hang in the thick, humid air. Reed took another step, his stance shifting into something predatory, a soldier's stance. "And what happens next?" he asked, his voice cold, calculated. "You start picking us off one by one? Or is that already happening?" Grayson chuckled, shaking his head. "You think I'm the only one here?" He spread his arms slightly, as if inviting them to look around. "You think I dragged all these bodies through the jungle by myself?" The silence that followed was deafening. The shadows between the trees felt heavier. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she realized what he was saying. He wasn't alone. There were more. Somewhere in the jungle, others were waiting, watching. Stephen muttered a curse under his breath, taking a step back, but Grayson only laughed again. "You can run if you want. It won't matter." His expression darkened slightly, his smirk flattening. You're already where you're supposed to be. Evelyn's mind was racing, analyzing every word, every clue. This wasn't just a random hijacking. This wasn't a coincidence. The plane was always meant to crash. They were brought here for a reason. But why? And for who? Mia's voice came out in a terrified whisper. "What do you want from us?" Grayson turned toward her slowly, his knife spinning lightly between his fingers. "Not me." His lips curled upward again. "Them." And then the jungle moved. Not just a rustling of leaves. Something bigger. A shift in the shadows. More than one figure. More than two. The realization hit them all at once. They were surrounded. Evelyn clenched her fists, heart pounding. Whatever was about to happen, it had just begun. The jungle came alive in an instant. The heavy foliage that had once seemed motionless shifted, figures emerging from the shadows like they had been waiting for this exact moment. Dark shapes, human but wrong. Some were barefoot, their clothes tattered and stained, their skin streaked with dirt and something darker. Others wore scraps of uniform-soled flight attendant jackets, faded pilot shirts, ripped and re-sewn into something almost ceremonial. Their eyes shallow, sunken, unblinking, locked onto the survivors with an unnatural stillness. Evelyn's instincts screamed at her to run, fight, do something, but her body refused to move. There were too many of them. They weren't just outnumbered, they were hunted. Mia's breath hitched in her throat as she clutched Reed's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Who are they?" Grayson, still smirking, stepped forward, moving with easy familiarity, like he belonged among them. And then, Evan understood. He did. He wasn't just the hijacker, he was part of them. Reed tightened his grip on his knife, his stance shifting into something ready, a soldier's instinct kicking in. "We're not going with you," he said evenly, his voice razor sharp, controlled despite the overwhelming situation. Grayson let out a low chuckle, amused. "Who said you had a choice?" A ripple of movement from the other side, subtle tightening of their formation, a silent command that Evelyn didn't need words to understand. They weren't just standing there, they were closing in. Evelyn's fingers curled into fists. This isn't the first crash. Her voice was strong, but inside, she was unraveling. This wasn't just survival. This was something else. A pattern. A ritual. A trap. "How many flights have you brought here?" she demanded, stepping forward. "How many people have you lured into this?" Grayson's smirk widened. "Enough." A low murmur rippled through the gathered figures, their heads tilting slightly, listening, as if they understood every word, but had no need to speak. It was the most disturbing thing Evelyn had ever seen. Stephen let out a sharp breath, stepping back, his voice shaking. "This isn't real. This isn't happening." His hands balled into fists. "Planes don't just disappear. This doesn't—" "You think people notice?" Grayson interrupted smoothly, his dark eyes locking onto Stephen like a predator sizing up prey. "Think about it. A plane lost over the Pacific. No distress signal. No wreckage ever found. The world moves on." His smile was almost pitying. Planes don't just disappear, unless someone wants them to. Evelyn's stomach twisted. They were never meant to land anywhere else. She turned her gaze to the others, studying them the way they moved, the way they watched. Not wild, not mindless. Trained, conditioned, survivors who had become something else. Servants to whatever this was. Reed exhaled, his muscles tensing. "What do you want?" Grayson's grin widened. "Not me." He gestured behind him, to the dense jungle, where something loomed just beyond the firelight, a presence, massive and unseen, like the jungle itself was breathing. Them. And then, the first figure lunged. The figure lunged so fast that Evelyn barely had time to react. A blur of skin and shadow, too quick, too persistent, not wild, but trained. Reed moved first. His soldier instincts took over, his makeshift knife slashing upward, catching the attacker across the arm. The figure hissed in pain, stumbling back, but not like a person retreating, like a predator reassessing. And then, chaos. The jungle exploded with movement. More of them came from the shadows, silent, efficient. Some carried crude weapon-sharpened bones, jagged metal, ropes woven from vines. Others needed nothing but their hands. Evelyn barely had time to throw herself back as one came straight for her. A woman with hollow eyes, a face that might have once been soft but was now hardened by years on this island. Evelyn hit the ground hard, her elbows scraping against the dirt as the woman grabbed for her throat. Mia screamed. Stephen stumbled, tripping over a root, barely dodging a swinging blade. Reed was holding his ground, dodging, slashing, kicking, his military training keeping him alive. But there were too many. Evelyn twisted hard, rolling away as the woman lunged again. Her fingers barely grazed Evelyn's neck before Evelyn's hand closed around a sharp rock, swinging blindly. A sickening crack, the woman reeled back, blood streaking her forehead, and Evelyn didn't wait to see if she was getting up. Run! The word came from Reed, but Evelyn was already moving. Adrenaline took over. The others were closing in, too many, too fast. She saw Grayson standing back, watching, amused, entertained. He wasn't fighting, because he didn't have to. They weren't trying to kill them. They were hurting them. Evelyn's stomach twisted as she realized they were being driven somewhere, forced deeper into the jungle, toward whatever them meant. Reed was fighting his way toward her, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her up from where she had fallen. Stephen was limping but alive, his face pale as he clutched a deep gash in his side. They had seconds. Evelyn bolted. She ran. Branches whipped at her face. Roots snagged her feet. But she kept going, forcing herself forward, following Reed as they plunged deeper into the unknown. And then, suddenly, the trees ended. Evelyn skidded to a stop, her breath catching in her throat as she nearly went over the edge. The ground dropped away beneath them, a sheer cliff, a violent drop to the ocean below. Trapped. Stephen stumbled to a halt beside her, his breath ragged. Mia let out a choked sob. Reed spun, his knife raised, but Grayson was already there. He emerged slowly from the trees, calm, victorious. Behind him, the others fanned out, forming a loose half-circle. No longer attacking, just waiting. The hunt was over. Evelyn's heart pounded. They had been driven to the edge for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it was coming. Evelyn stood at the very edge of the cliff, her breath coming in sharp, uneven bursts as she stared down at the crashing waves below. The drop was too high to survive, the jagged rocks lurking beneath the water like waiting teeth. They were trapped. Stephen clutched his bleeding side, his face pale and slick with sweat. Mia's hands trembled as she took a half-step back, her wide eyes darting between Evelyn and Reed, searching for an escape that didn't exist. And then, Grayson stepped forward. He moved slowly, confidently, like a man who had done this before. His dark eyes gleamed with satisfaction, the blood on his sleeve drying into a dark, rust-colored stain. Behind him, the others stood in eerie silence, their expressions blank, detached, waiting. Some of them still held their crude weapons, but none of them moved. They didn't need to. They had already won. Evelyn clenched her fists, trying to steady her thoughts. Think! She had been in dangerous situations before. She had survived war zones, stared down corrupt politicians, gone undercover in criminal rings. But this was something else. This wasn't just survival, this was ritual. Grayson stopped a few feet away, tilting his head slightly as he studied them. "You feel it, don't you?" he said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. "That pull, that presence." His gaze flicked toward the jungle as if something unseen was lurking just beyond the trees. "It's always been here, long before us, long before you." Evelyn forced her breathing to slow. "What are you talking about?" Grayson smiled. "You think this is about a plane crash? About hijacking a flight?" He exhaled, shaking his head slightly, almost disappointed. "We're standing on something ancient, Hayes. Something that doesn't belong in your world, but reaches into it anyway." He lifted his arms slightly, as if gesturing to the entire island. "Every few years a flight disappears. People go missing. You think they just vanish into the ocean?" His smirk returned. "Number, they come here. Asterisk, asterisk." Stephen let out a ragged breath. "That's insane," he muttered. Grayson chuckled. "Is it?" He gestured toward the others, the silent, unblinking figures watching their every move. "Look at them. They were just like you once. Tourists, businessmen, flight attendants, survivors. They fought it, just like you're fighting it now." He stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. "But they lost." Evelyn's skin crawled. She looked at the others, really looked at them. Their eyes weren't just blank. They were empty, hollowed out, as if something had taken the parts of them that mattered and left only the shell. Mia shook her head violently, her hands balled into trembling fists. "Number? No, this is a cult. This is some brainwashing thing, right? Right?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Evelyn could hear the desperate hope behind it. She wanted someone to tell her that this was just a nightmare that would end. But no one did. Grayson sighed. "I don't expect you to understand yet." He gestured toward the jungle. "But they're waiting, and they don't like to wait long." And then the ground rumbled. Not like an earthquake, not like a storm. Something deeper, something alive. The air itself shifted, charged with a silent energy, a low humming vibration that pulsed beneath their feet. The others tilted their heads in unison, as if listening to something that only they could hear. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. Reed took a sharp breath. "What the hell was that?" Grayson smiled. "That," he murmured, "was your invitation." And then the jungle moved. The trees shook, bending unnaturally, as if something massive was pushing its way forward. A shadow loomed, too tall, too wrong. A shape that didn't make sense, shifting, warping, pulsing. Not an animal, not human. Something else. Mia let out a strangled sob, clutching Stephen's arm as he staggered back in horror. Even Reed, strong, unshakable Reed, looked frozen, his grip tightening on his knife. Evelyn's pulse pounded in her ears. Whatever was coming, it wasn't of this world, and it wanted them. The jungle parted, branches snapping, vines twisting as something enormous and unseen pushed its way forward. The air thickened, humming with an unnatural energy that crawled over Evelyn's skin, sinking into her bones like a living thing. She wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but her body refused to move. It was as if the very island itself had taken hold of them, rooting them to the ground. Reed gritted his teeth, his fingers tightening around his knife. But for the first time since they crashed, he looked afraid. Mia had gone completely still, her breath shallow, her eyes locked on the shifting, impossible shape coming toward them. Even Stephen, bleeding and barely standing, let out a choked whimper, his body sagging as if his mind had already decided there was no escaping this. Evelyn forced herself to really look at whatever was coming, and that was when she realized it wasn't just one thing. It was many. Shadows within shadows. A shape that never settled. Arms where there shouldn't be arms. Faces where there shouldn't be faces. Eyes that blinked out of existence before appearing somewhere else entirely. Not a creature. Not a man. Something ancient. Something wrong. Something that had been waiting here for longer than time itself. The others, Grayson's followers, the empty-eyed one saw, sank to their knees, heads bowed, breathing in sync. A silent, reverent surrender. And then the whispers came back. This time, Evelyn understood them. Not in words, not in sentences, but in meaning. It had been waiting. It was hungry. And they, the survivors, were the offering. Evelyn's stomach twisted violently. She turned toward Grayson, her voice sharp, ragged, barely holding back the terror bubbling up inside of her. "What did you do?" she hissed. Grayson smiled, like he had been waiting for her to ask. "I survived," he said simply. The ground shook beneath them, a pulse of something unseen, a wave of energy that stole the breath from Evelyn's lungs. The shadows that made up the thing in the jungle stretched forward, curling like fingers, reaching for them. Mia screamed. Stephen stumbled back. Reed lifted his knife. But Grayson? He just stepped aside. Because this wasn't about him. It was about them. The island had chosen. Evelyn had 1 second, one memento make a choice. Fight. Or become part of the island. She chose, and she ran. Evelyn's body moved before her mind could catch up, her instincts overriding logic, telling her that if she stayed even a second longer, she would never leave this place a liver worse. She would leave changed. She bolted, her legs pushing against the heavy ground as her lungs burned, the humid air thick with something unnatural, pressing down on her like invisible hands trying to drag her back. She didn't know if the others followed, didn't dare look behind to check if Reed or Mia or Steven had made the same choice, because every fiber of her being screamed that if she turned back now, she wouldn't be running anymore, she'd be one of them. The jungle was a blur, trees warping in her peripheral vision, the ground shaking beneath her feet like it was alive, the island itself rejecting her escape. But she forced herself forward, past the twisted branches, past the gnarled roots that clawed at her ankles, past the shadows that flickered between the trees, moving in ways that didn't make sense. The whispers followed her, inside her head now, growing louder, demanding, the voices of the lost and the taken, those who had run before her and failed. And the worst part was, she knew they were waiting for her to fail too. You were never supposed to leave. She clenched her teeth, shaking her head violently as if the action alone could silence them, but the whispers only deepened, the words turning into something elsey name, her name, over and over, calling her back. The trees thickened, closing in. The path she swore had been there twisting, changing, forcing her to stumble, to slow, to hesitate. And in that hesitation, she heard the thing behind her move, a shift, a breath, a presence pressing against the very fabric of reality itself. And then came the sound, the low, guttural pull of something inhaling, a breath so deep, so vast. It felt like it was sucking the air straight out of the world, pulling everything toward it, pulling her toward it. Her feet dragged, her vision swam, the edges of the jungle distorting like a heat wave, the whispers rising into a deafening, hungry chorus. She wasn't going to make it. She knew it. She had seen it in Grayson's smile, in the way he stepped aside, like he had seen it happen before because he had. She was just another part of the cycle, another offering, another story waiting to be erased. And just as her body started to give, just as she felt herself slipping, a hand yanked her forward. A strong, unrelenting grip pulled her back to the world, away from the thing that waited, away from the whispers, away from the choice she had already made. Reed, he was still here, still fighting, his grip bruising her wrist as he dragged her forward. And through the dizziness, through the screaming in her head, she saw the beach, the open sky, the last remnants of daylight, the broken wreckage of their past life waiting for them. And for one brief, fleeting second, she thought they had made it. But then the whispers stopped, the jungle fell silent, the pull disappeared, and that was when she realized they weren't chasing anymore, because they didn't have to. They had already won. And as her foot hit the sand, as she gasped for breath and turned back toward the jungle, she understood the truth in its full, horrifying clarity. They hadn't escaped. They had been let go. And whatever was waiting in the jungle, whatever had claimed the island, had only done so because it already knew the truth. They were never getting off this island. Not today. Not ever. Evelyn stumbled onto the sand, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps as she fought to convince herself they had truly escaped. The wreckage of Flight 217 loomed ahead, a twisted metal carcass half buried in the shore, a stark reminder that their world had ended the moment they crashed. Reed was beside her, his grip still tight on her arm, his own breath uneven, but his expression was unreadable. A soldier, calculating the next move, the next battle. Behind them, Mia fell to her knees, sobbing, her hands pressed against her face, while Steven collapsed onto the sand, his chest rising and falling rapidly, blood still seeping from his wound. The jungle did not move. The whispers had gone silent, and that was the worst part, because it wasn't over. They hadn't won. Evelyn turned back toward the trees, half expecting to see Grayson standing there, watching, smirking, but he was gone. They all were. No footsteps, no signs of movement, just the thick, oppressive wall of green that loomed over them like a living thing, breathing, waiting. The island had let them run, but not because it had lost them, because it knew something they didn't. "We need to signal for help," Reed said suddenly, his voice low, even but not steady. "The wreckage there's still emergency flares. A radio. We can make a fire something." He wasn't looking at her as he spoke. He was staring out toward the ocean, the vast, endless expanse of water that stretched into the horizon. Empty. No ships, no planes, no way out. Evelyn followed his gaze, the weight of reality pressing against her chest like an iron vice. They had been in the air for hours before the crash. The search radius was too large. No one knew where they were. And worse, what if no one was looking? Mia let out a sharp breath, finally lifting her head, her tear-streaked face filled with a kind of terror that wouldn't leave her eyes. "Not ever. We have to get off this island," she whispered, her voice barely holding together. "We can't stay here. She cut herself off, shaking her head violently, her fingers digging into the sand as if she could wake up from this nightmare, if she just held on to something real. Evelyn wanted to tell her it would be okay. She wanted to believe it herself, but then the first sign came, a soft crackling sound. At first, Evelyn thought it was a fire, or static from a broken radio. Then she realized it was the intercom. The half-destroyed cockpit still had power, and somewhere inside the wreckage, the old, mangled intercom fizzled to life. A voice came through. Not a distress call. Not a transmission from the outside world. It was the pilot, the same one who had spoken before the crash. His voice crackled and distorted, cutting in and out, but Evelyn recognized it instantly. She had heard this before, but that was impossible. "This is Flight 217 preparing for descent. Estimated arrival." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Reed took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto the wreckage as the static twisted and warped, the pilot's voice repeating, again and again. "Flight 217, preparing for descent. Estimated arrival." Mia clapped her hands over her ears, shaking her head violently. "No, no, no!" Stephen just stared, his mouth open, his face drained of all color. Evelyn forced herself to move, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs as she stepped toward the cockpit, toward the source of the impossible transmission. She climbed over the twisted debris, past the shattered windows, into the broken remains of the plane, her fingers gripping the edge of the intercom panel as static hissed and the words looped again. "Flight 217, preparing for descent. Estimated arrival." Her breath hitched, the static warped, and then it changed. The voice was still the pilot's, but now he was screaming. Evelyn stumbled back. The words were garbled, twisted, but she could hear it, beneath the static, beneath the distortion, the moment of the crash. The exact moment their plane had gone down, and yet, it was happening now. She turned, heart pounding, mouth dry. "It's a loop," she whispered. "It's all a loop." The others, the flight log from 20 years ago, the way the jungle never let them go too far. The island wasn't just where the plane had crashed, it was where the plane was meant to crash. Again, and again. Forever. Reed exhaled slowly, staring at her like he understood what she was saying but refused to believe it. Mia sobbed into her hands, shaking her head. Stephen sat down, staring blankly at nothing. Evelyn turned back toward the ocean, and that's when she saw it. A shadow in the distance. Not a ship. Not a rescue plane. Another aircraft, approaching from the clouds, descending toward the island. The next flight, 217. Their replacements. And deep in the jungle, beneath the heavy silence, the whispers began again. They weren't done yet. The island was waiting. Evelyn stood frozen on the shore, watching the impossible unfold. The sky above was streaked with fading sunlight, the last remnants of day sinking behind the endless ocean. But none of it mattered. The plane was coming. Another flight, 217, gliding toward its fate, just as they had. Her body refused to move. Her mind refused to accept it. But deep down, she already knew. Reed was the first to speak, his voice low, cold. "This is what happens." He turned toward her, his expression unreadable, but his clenched fists said enough. "This is what always happens." Evelyn's breath came shallow and sharp. "We're part of it now." She hated saying it. She hated knowing it was true. Mia let out a broken sob, dropping onto the sand, her hands tangling into her hair like she was trying to hold on to something real, something solid. Stephen just sat there, silent, numb, staring at the water like he was already gone. The jungle behind them was silent, watching, waiting. The whispers had stopped, because they didn't need to whisper anymore. Evelyn turned back toward the sky, toward the descending plane, the shape growing clearer by the second. She could almost imagine the passengers inside laughing, sleeping, unaware. They had no idea what was coming. She wanted to scream at them, warn them, tell them to turn back. But it wouldn't matter. The island had already chosen. It always chose. A new cycle was beginning. Evelyn's fingers curled into the sand, her nails digging deep as her heartbeat pounded against her ribs, her mind racing. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to break the pattern, because if there wasn't, then they weren't just survivors. They were the next others, and the island was waiting for them to take their place.